Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another special gathering. Before we begin, I want to know who's here with me tonight. Leave a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. All right, let's get to the first story. I grew up listening to stories about truckers told by my father, Walter, who has spent most of his life on the road for over 20 years. For him, hauling freight from one end of the country to the other isn't just a job, it's what truly defines him. When I was a kid, I would wake up in the early morning hours and peek through a crack in the curtain, watching him leave the house holding a cup of bitter coffee. It took many years before I, Gus, finally got a chance to join my dad on one of his trips. I never imagined that on that very first ride, something would happen that would completely change the way I saw the American highways. The opportunity came during winter break, right after classes ended. My dad invited me to ride along from Chicago all the way to Fresno, California. The plan was to deliver a load of auto parts and then haul back fresh fruit from the region. I was excited, dreaming of finally experiencing life in the cab, watching the scenery fly by and stopping at roadside diners for warm biscuits. During the first few days, everything went smoothly. Interstate 40 was busy. We made our stops without any trouble, and I enjoyed every minute with my dad. I watched him talk on the CB radio with other drivers about fuel prices and those infamous trouble spots, stretches where thefts and accidents happen often. He always seemed confident, his hands steady on the wheel and his eyes glued to the mirrors. On the third night, somewhere near New Mexico, we hit a more deserted stretch. Traffic thinned out, and exhaustion got the better of me. My dad insisted I take a nap in the passenger seat. I eventually fell asleep, but I woke up suddenly, not knowing why. I kept quiet, trying to get my bearings, until I realized the air felt off, heavier. It seemed like the truck was moving more slowly, even though the engine still sounded strong. I glanced over at my dad. He was still focused on the empty road ahead, but I noticed his grip on the steering wheel was tighter than usual, as if he was nervous. Then I saw something in the side mirror, a quick, undefined shape like someone clinging to the trailer. For a second, I thought it was just a reflection. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, still clouded by sleep, but a chill ran down my spine. "Dad, did you notice that?" I asked, my voice unsteady. He kept his eyes on the road, let out a sigh, and replied, "Yeah, I saw. But stay calm, son. It might be a reflection or a shadow. We'll stop at the next truck stop." I noticed his voice tremble slightly, which was unusual. Almost an hour passed before we saw a sign for a small truck stop. It was a simple place, just a couple of pumps, a modest convenience store, and a large dirt lot where a few trucks were parked. A skinny, dark-haired dog wandered near the wash area. As soon as we pulled in, a young guy named Ronnie, he didn't look older than 18, came over to talk to us. He greeted my dad, but kept staring at the truck, as if he sensed something was wrong. Before we got out, the dog started barking out of nowhere, a panicked sound. At first I thought it was just what dogs do, but Ronnie went pale. "You'd better not stay here too long," he muttered, casting a worried glance at the trailer. My dad frowned, confused. "What's going on, buddy?" he asked, trying to keep calm. "It's already up there," Ronnie swallowed hard. "Just keep driving, Mr. Walter. If you stop, it could get worse." He seemed genuinely scared. By now, the dog was already running off to the other side, tail between its legs. I felt a shiver run through me, and I clutched the seat. I noticed my dad looking at the fuel gauge before making his decision. He set his jaw, checked we had enough diesel to reach the next town, and fired up the engine again. "We still have enough to roll a good stretch, son," he whispered, almost as if talking to himself. "I'm not risking staying here after hearing that." The rest of the night passed in silence. I tried to doze, but every rattling sound the truck made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there following us. At one point I glanced at the mirror again, but all I saw was total darkness. Maybe that was worse than seeing something. I noticed my dad's heavy breathing and the way he wiped his forehead from time to time, which only made me more uneasy. We arrived at a warehouse on the outskirts of Fresno in the early morning hours. The sun was just starting to rise, lighting up the unloading yard. As soon as we got out, my dad went straight to the back of the truck. I followed, heart pounding, hoping it was all in my head. but we came face to face with these dark streaks along the side, like soot or ash. They looked like handprints, finger marks smeared in a thin layer of burnt dust. It made my stomach knot. We stood there speechless until some workers from the depot came to receive the load. One of them, seeing my dad crouched next to the marks, asked, "Did you have any trouble out there on the road?" He pointed to the streaks. "I've seen something like that on another truck. Folks say it's a bad sign." My dad looked at me before answering. Nothing I want to talk about right now," he said in a hushed voice. "Can we just unload?" "Sure," the guy shrugged. "I'll get some help." Later, while they were unloading, I stepped back and stared at the truck from a distance, trying to make sense of it all. A few older drivers who'd traveled all over the country came over and shared stories about supernatural hitchhikers, but only in whispers, like they didn't want to draw attention. That made everything feel even more real and terrifying. After that night, I could never lie down on a truck's passenger seat without remembering that shape in the mirror or the feeling that something was riding with us. Despite it all, my dad kept on with his work. And me? Well, to this day, whenever I hear the rumble of a diesel engine in the dark, I feel that chill come back, like the road still owes me an explanation. Before we move on to the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to get the latest stories. Your presence means a lot, and your support is essential. All right, let's keep going. I'm a foreman for a construction company out in a rural area near a small American town. My day starts pretty early before the sun even comes up. I drive about 20 miles every single day to and from the construction site. Most of the workers live nearby, so they either walk or carpool with each other, but I've got to make the longer trip on my own. One day I ended up working late at the site. It was already past 11 by the time I put away my tools and locked up the storage container. I remember saying goodbye to Harold, the night watchman, who started his shift the moment I left. Just to reach the main road, I had to deal with a stretch of dirt road full of potholes and bumps, and the darkness didn't help. There was hardly any lighting. When I finally got onto the paved highway, I realized how the night had swallowed up everything around me. At that hour, there were no lights from houses, bars, or grocery stores, just a few streetlights here and there spaced far apart. It was as I passed a fork in the road on the left that I noticed the silhouette of an older woman standing under the weak glow of a streetlight. She wore a long skirt and was holding something I couldn't make out, maybe a crumpled handkerchief or an old purse, I'm not sure. A little farther back, I noticed a small child in a light-colored dress, kind of grimy, standing not too far from her. They seemed to be together, yet there was no sign of warmth or physical closeness between them. I didn't know what to do. The place was deserted, it was late, and the whole scene unsettled me in a strange way. I thought about driving on, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I slowed down, stopped beside them, and rolled down the window. "Good evening. Ma'am, are you heading into town?" She looked at me warily, sizing me up for a few seconds before nodding. At that moment, I could only see her face clearly. The little girl seemed to have moved farther back into the shadows, almost as if she was hiding. "If you'd like, I can drop you off closer to the center. This late, the buses don't run anymore," I said, already imagining it wasn't safe for them to stay in that spot. She took a while to reply, but finally agreed. I suggested she sit in the back seat because the front seat was packed with tools and papers, and also I figured she'd be more comfortable back there. As soon as she got in, I noticed her clothes were dirty, as if she'd rolled down a ditch or something. They had a damp, moldy smell that made me wrinkle my nose right away. I started the car, and as I settled in, I thought I caught another glimpse of that little girl in the light dress standing near the streetlight. But when I checked the rearview mirror, there was nothing. I must be exhausted, I told myself, trying to focus on the road. Even so, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had crept over me. A few minutes went by in total silence, until I heard a faint whisper from the back seat. "He's a good man, yes he is." I looked in the rearview mirror immediately, but the woman was staring out the window, not saying a word. I asked, "Were you talking to me, ma'am?" She shook her head, keeping the same closed-off expression. My whole body tensed up. The road was getting worse, with more patches and potholes, and I tried to keep a steady pace to avoid the bigger holes. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't alone in the car. I tried to make conversation, asked where she was coming from, but her answers were short and vague. Feeling uneasy with the silence, I pressed on. "Sorry, but were you by yourself back there? It's pretty dangerous at this hour." She took a long time to respond, as if she didn't understand the question. Finally, in a low voice, she said, "People of faith never walk alone." That line made me grip the steering wheel tighter. For a moment, I thought I saw a small figure behind her on the seat, but when I looked again, there was nothing. I decided to keep quiet. I just wanted to reach a more populated area, but I knew I still had a few miles ahead. Suddenly, she asked me to stop near another dirt road, which looked even darker than the last one. I peered out the window and couldn't see any houses, street lights, or any indication that someone might live out there. I insisted, "Are you sure, Mom? It's really dark. Wouldn't you rather I take you a bit farther?" She shook her head, thanking me and saying that this was good enough. Before getting out, she gently touched my shoulder and wished me good luck in a way that left me speechless. I just nodded, watching her step away. That's when I noticed the same little girl in the light-colored dress walking beside her, keeping a distance that felt almost ceremonial. At no point did they touch or even look at each other, yet they moved together into the darkness. For a few seconds, I just sat there with the engine running, unable to shift into gear. I watched them until they disappeared from sight, swallowed by the night. There was no wind, no chirping of crickets, nothing. The silence was so thick it felt like everything around me had stopped breathing. I took a deep breath, sipped some water from the bottle on my dashboard and drove on. I don't know if it was just sheer exhaustion, a waking dream, or something beyond explanation. But even now, recalling the woman's face and the child's demeanor, so quiet it hardly seemed real, I still find myself wondering about what happened that night. Maybe I was just too tired, but whenever I drive through that area after dark, I take a quick look in the rearview mirror, wondering if that little girl is still there, walking alongside someone who apparently never walks alone. I was 22 years old when my grandmother asked me to take her back to the place where she was born, deep in rural West Virginia. She had been living with us for over 10 years, but she rarely spoke about her hometown. It seemed like remembering that place hurt more than it comforted her. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon, we got the news of the death of an old acquaintance of hers, Mr. Walker, and suddenly my grandmother decided she had to go back. Nothing could convince her otherwise. She wanted to attend the funeral no matter what. I was surprised. My grandmother, who always avoided talking about the past, was now willing to face hours on the road, climbing through mountain passes and taking a considerable risk to reach that tiny town nestled among the hills, almost without any signs or directions. I tried to argue that we could leave the next morning when it would be safer, but she just shook her head and said, "There's no time to lose." In less than an hour, we were in my car, with a hastily packed suitcase and the faith she always carried around her neck, a St. Christopher medal. As soon as we left the last bigger city behind, I felt the tension rising. I had heard stories about robbers who attacked cars stopped on these winding roads, especially at the end of the day. It wasn't a tourist route. Only people who lived around there or had family in the area ever passed through. The road was narrow, full of potholes in some stretches, with steep hills and dense woods or rocky walls on both sides. The landscape was almost beautiful, but I couldn't relax. My focus was on arriving before nightfall. My grandmother spent most of the trip in silence, murmuring prayers under her breath. Every so often she would cross herself, as if something bad might happen at any moment. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her eyes closed, her fingers wrapped around that St. Christopher medal. It made me even more nervous because the silence, coupled with my own anxiety, created a strange atmosphere in the car, like we were heading to a place that no longer felt like ours. Late in the afternoon, I felt the steering wheel pull to the left. I tried to keep the car in the lane, but I soon had to stop on a dirt shoulder. I got out without even turning off the engine to check, and of course it was the worst-case scenario. The left rear tire was flat, completely out of air. "Oh no," I muttered, trying to hide my desperation. I did know how to change a tire, but I couldn't remember where I had put the car jack, since the car was still new to me. And doing it alone, with barely any daylight left, felt daunting. I looked at my grandmother expecting some reaction, but she just squeezed her eyes shut even tighter and clutched the medal to her chest. Part of me wanted to shake her and ask why she wasn't saying anything. Another part understood that praying was how she dealt with fear. Still, I needed to fix the situation. I popped the trunk, searched for the toolbox, but the jack wasn't where it was supposed to be. While I was rummaging through the mess, I heard the sound of an engine approaching slowly. I straightened up and saw a large pickup truck, something you'd see on a farm, with windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. I stood still, trying to keep calm, but my heart felt like it was about to pound out of my chest. The truck stopped a few yards ahead, partially on the road. I had the distinct feeling someone was watching me. My grandmother, still in the car, lowered her head even more and continued praying softly. Those seconds lasted an eternity. I thought of all the robbery and kidnapping stories I'd ever heard, of people who were found dead in the woods by the side of the road. I even thought about running into the forest, but what about my grandmother? She could never outrun anyone. I tried to spot some kind of silhouette inside the truck, but I saw nothing. Suddenly the engine revved louder, and the vehicle drove off, heading back the way it came. I almost collapsed with relief, but I was still afraid they might return. I got back into the driver's seat, door still open, unsure of what to do. There was no cell signal, not a single house in sight. It felt like we were cut off from the world. My grandmother opened her eyes, looked at me with tenderness, and murmured something that sounded like a prayer to Saint Christopher. I tried to stay calm, wondering if I should drive on the rim until the next town, but that seemed risky too. That was when a second car appeared, an old model with flashing headlights, which parked a few yards behind us. I tensed up again, but a tall man, probably in his 40s, wearing a broad-brimmed hat, got out. He waved politely and asked, "Everything okay here? Do you need help?" I couldn't hide my relief, though I was still hesitant to trust a stranger at that hour. Even so, he had a calm demeanor, and without waiting for my answer, he opened his trunk and pulled out a hydraulic jack and some tools. My grandmother studied his face carefully, as if she were trying to remember where she knew him from. Suddenly, he looked at her too, appearing surprised. "Grandma Nancy, don't you remember me? I'm Mark, son of Mr. Alvin, who used to work with your son." My fingers went cold. That explained his reaction, but it was still uncanny to imagine the coincidence of running into someone who knew my grandmother all those years ago on this stretch of road. Mark said he was returning early from another small town without really understanding why. "A gut feeling," he said. To me, it sounded like one of those signs my grandmother's faith always made me question. He changed the tire in a few minutes while I held the flashlight and kept an eye on the road, still afraid that the pickup truck might come back. When he was done, Mark suggested we hit the road as soon as possible and offered to drive behind us to make sure we reached our destination safely. When we finally saw the sign for the town, I felt both relieved and unsettled. It seemed like that road would never end, but now I could breathe again, as if I were waking up from a bad dream. I parked by a small dusty square surrounded by old houses and a simple little church. Mark drove past us, gave a short honk, and went on his way. My grandmother made a grateful gesture and clutched her St. Christopher medal again. Mr. Walker's funeral took place the next morning, but I couldn't stop thinking about what happened on the road. What if Mark hadn't shown up? Would that pickup truck have come back to do us harm, or was it just someone curious? And what were the odds that we'd run into a man who actually knew my grandmother, right when we needed help the most? She had no doubt it was more than a coincidence. As for me, I still don't know what to say. I only know that after that I started carrying a crucifix and a St. Christopher image in my car, always saying a little prayer before taking any lonely road again. If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to leave a like. It really makes a difference. Okay, let's continue. Driving through rural Texas had never struck me as dangerous. My cousin Camilla and I were used to hitting the road to sort out college errands or visit relatives. That weekend, we left before dawn to avoid the heavy traffic near the city. Both of us were excited. She had just gotten a new car, and this would be our first longer trip with it. The drive out was smooth, and we decided to return the same day to save on lodging. After taking care of everything at college, we hit the highway back in the late afternoon, assuming it would be less crowded. We chatted about everything: graduation plans, the rush of internships, how much we missed home. The sky was perfectly clear, and the setting sun painted the horizon with a warm orange glow. Around 6:30 in the evening, we entered a more isolated stretch of highway. The scenery was mostly low vegetation, distant cornfields, and hardly any gas stations. The weather was pleasant, so we rolled down the windows a bit to enjoy the breeze. That's when the car began acting up. First, the music streaming from the phone started to cut out, like it was stuttering. Suddenly, the dashboard lights went off. Camilla tried to press the accelerator, but nothing happened. The engine sputtered and simply died. We lost power steering and headlights, and to make matters worse, we were on a slight incline, causing the car to slowly roll backward. My heart was pounding. She stomped on the brake, but the pedal felt stiff. Even pulling the parking brake didn't stop us right away. We slid back a bit until we finally left the asphalt and bumped onto a small dirt shoulder. After the initial shock, we were relieved no other cars were behind us at that moment. I stepped out to check if there was a leak or anything visibly wrong. Camilla also got out, still breathing hard, and used her phone flashlight to inspect the engine. We didn't see anything strange there. While she attempted to start the car again, I started feeling an odd vibe. It was like the air got heavier, and I had an uneasy feeling in my chest. I thought it was just nerves from the scare, but when I looked at her, I could see the same unsettled look in her eyes. I took a few steps behind the car, almost as if something was pulling me that way. That's when I noticed a mound of dirt in a ditch near a broken fence. Dry leaves covered it, but it looked like someone had disturbed the area recently. It was a rounded pile that seemed out of place. Camilla followed me silently. We nudged some leaves aside with our shoes. Suddenly, beneath the loose dirt, we saw something that looked like a piece of pale skin. I froze. She let out a muffled scream, dropped her phone flashlight, and in its glare we could see it was undoubtedly a thin, motionless human hand. We didn't say a word. It was like our throats had dried up. All I could think was, we have to get out of here. I grabbed Camilla by the arm, and we ran back to the car. She jumped in, turned the key, and the engine started without hesitation, as if nothing had ever happened. We didn't stop to question how it suddenly worked. We just got out of there as fast as we could. We drove for almost half an hour until we found a small gas station selling snacks and serving coffee from a simple dispenser. We stopped, still shaking. While Camilla sipped some water to calm her nerves, I used my phone to call the highway patrol, explaining everything we had seen. I gave them the approximate location, described the mound of dirt, and said there was something or someone buried there. The dispatcher asked plenty of questions, and I answered all of them honestly. After that trip, I never again underestimated how a seemingly ordinary situation can turn into a nightmare in seconds. I still carry the memory of that buried hand to this day. I'm not sure if it was chance, fate, or some greater force that stopped us at that spot. I just pray the authorities found that person and brought some decent closure to the situation. And every time I drive through a deserted stretch of highway, I get a knot in my stomach that reminds me sometimes the worst thing isn't what we can see, but what's hidden right beneath our feet. Good evening, Dom. I decided to write to you because after so long trying to brush this story aside, I realized I need to share what I went through. My name is Mark Garrison, though most of my trucking buddies just call me Mac. I'm originally from a small town near Odessa, Texas, but nowadays I live further inland after many years driving across the United States as a trucker. My dad, August Garrison, was also a driver. He says he learned everything from his grandfather, who used to haul lumber back when the roads were even rougher and courage was your only brake. Ever since I was a kid, I'd joined Dad on short trips, learned to drive out by the cotton fields near my uncle's place, and before I knew it, I had my commercial driver's license in hand, hauling freight clear across the map. In 2010, I got the chance to work for a trucking company in Abilene, out in southwestern Texas. The job was taking soybeans down to the port of Houston or bringing agricultural supplies back to the interior. It wasn't my dream gig, but it paid the bills, and I still enjoyed that loneliness of the open road. Just me, my thoughts, and classic country music on the CB radio. Around that time, I was running a long stretch along US Route 90, passing through the Davis Mountains. It was known for sharp curves, steep climbs, and, naturally, its share of ghost stories. Not everyone believes in that stuff. I didn't pay much attention myself. But when you're driving late at night through deserted areas, hearing weird static over the radio, or seeing strange lights in your mirror, your mind starts wandering. Sometimes you can't help but wonder if it's just imagination. One of my trips, sometime in August of that year, I'd left Houston after unloading soybeans. Instead of sleeping at a truck stop near the city limits, I decided to push on. There was a station I liked before hitting Avery Pass, a stretch similar to the next big climb, but to get there I'd have to drive about 70 or 80 miles. I felt alert enough and figured I could make it. I left the station around 11 at night, tank full. The highway was calm, almost no traffic except for the occasional truck passing me. I kept the country tunes going, mind clear, driving at my own pace, watching the curves and road signs. Then I noticed a car in my mirror, its high beams blinding me. I thought it was someone in a rush wanting to get by. I even signaled to let them pass, but the car neither overtook me nor dimmed its lights. That started to bug me. I slowed down, expecting the car to move along, but it stayed right behind my trailer. I checked the right mirror, no good shoulder to pull over, so I sped up a bit, hoping to lose it, but it kept pace, always with those high beams on. My first thought was a robbery. That's the fear that hits you. But suddenly that bright light vanished, like someone had flicked a switch. I was on a straight stretch. There was nowhere the car could have disappeared so fast. It was like it had evaporated. I felt chills run down my spine. I kept driving, seeing no trace of that vehicle. About 15 minutes later, when I was approaching the downhill stretch before Avery Pass, I spotted a car about 500 yards ahead. Same intense headlights. It looked like an old sedan, maybe a vintage Chevy Impala. I wondered if I was just tired. But there it was, right in front, moving slowly. It hadn't passed me before, so how could it now be in front? And something else was off. The interior light was on, and I saw 4 or 5 figures inside. Just silhouettes, no visible faces. In the blink of an eye, the car sped up and vanished around the next curve. My heart jumped. I didn't see anything blatantly supernatural, but it was definitely strange. I had the sensation those people were staring at me, yet I couldn't make out their faces. I kept going, not sure whether to pray, call my dad, or pretend nothing happened. At the bottom of the descent, I saw headlights coming at me from the opposite lane, flickering like they were out of control. Then I realized it was the same car, interior light still on, swerving into my lane. I figured it had to be a drunk or high driver heading straight for me. The impact seemed inevitable, but it never happened. I only heard a muffled whoosh, like compressed air hitting metal, and my rig kept going without a scratch. I looked in the mirror right away, but there was no car, no debris. It was as if that vehicle had just passed through me. I was so rattled I nearly pulled over, but I pushed on until I reached the nearest truck stop. When I arrived, I needed several minutes just to catch my breath. I hopped out, drank some water, paced around. A gas station attendant noticed I was shaken and asked if I was sick. I said it was just nerves from night driving. I didn't have the guts to say I'd just seen a mystery car and experienced an impossible crash. I didn't know if it was some phenomenon or all in my head. To this day, I'm still not sure. During that stop, I ran into Jonathan J.J., a buddy who also hauls soybeans. He saw I looked pale and insisted I tell him what happened. I gave him the short version, leaving out the scarier details. He said that stretch is famous for bizarre sightings. Some folks claim they see an old car appearing and disappearing in the mountains, he said, fiddling with his thermos. My aunt lives in a little town nearby and swears there was a bad accident years ago with a Chevy full of teenagers, all killed on the spot. People say the car still roams around, stuck in that final moment. That made my stomach drop, but I chose not to dwell on it. I ate something, slept in the truck stop lot, and tried to forget. Maybe it was just rumor or road talk, but I couldn't really rest. I kept tossing in the bunk, recalling the voices I thought I heard, that impact that left no damage. It was disturbing. A few weeks later, I had to cover the same route in the opposite direction, heading from inland Texas back toward the coast. I'd spent a rough day loading bales, helping around the warehouse, and only hit the road by early evening. My plan was to reach a rest area past Avery Pass and sleep there. I was exhausted, but the company was in a hurry and I had no choice. Around midnight, I started up the pass, the most nerve-wracking part of the drive, with long climbs and tight curves. On one of those curves, my headlights caught something on the shoulder. At first glance, I thought it was a mannequin or a broken post, but as I got closer, I realized it was a woman. She stood still, arms hanging at her sides, staring at the road. She wore dark clothing, and her face had no readable expression. I thought about stopping to check if she needed help, but something inside me screamed not to. No other car or truck in sight, just that desolate stretch. My first suspicion was a robbery. Plenty of stories about criminals faking distress to hijack rigs. But as I passed her, a cold jolt shot up my neck, like my body was on high alert. I kept going, but even thinking about that figure made my hair stand on end. Suddenly, I heard a thud on the truck's side. Glancing in the mirror, I swear I saw the same woman running alongside the cab, matching my speed. This lasted only seconds, but it was unbelievably clear. I wasn't going fast, maybe 25 or 30 miles per hour uphill, but still no normal person could keep up with a truck like that on foot. I blinked, looked again, and she was gone. I tried to tell myself I was just tired. I splashed some water on my face, rolled down the window. A bit further, near the top of the pass, came the worst part. I felt weight on the passenger side step, like someone had climbed onto it. I dared a quick glance and nearly let go of the wheel. That same woman was standing there, gripping the door handle, staring at me, but her face, it didn't seem human. Like her eyes were missing something, and her mouth was just a blurred outline. My heart nearly stopped. I tried to pray but couldn't recall the right words. Only a verse my mom always quoted popped into my head. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. I kept repeating it over and over. When I finally worked up the courage to look again, she was gone. I reached the rest area trembling. I pulled over, circled my rig just to be sure, checking for footprints or damage that might prove my sanity. Found nothing. I sat on the low wall trying to calm down and lit a cigarette. Back then I still smoked, though I've quit since. Some fellow drivers saw me and asked what was wrong. I only said I heard a strange noise on the trailer. Sylvia Sis even joked it could have been an animal hitting the side. But once she saw my face, she realized I was spooked. I decided to keep quiet so I wouldn't sound crazy. I slept poorly, my mind replaying that figure and the overwhelming dread I felt. Back in Abilene, I kept my mouth shut at the company. I went about my work as usual. But a few weeks later, during soybean harvest, I had to face that same highway again, this time in a convoy with 2 other trucks. Driving in a group usually feels safer. We planned a pre-dawn departure so we'd clear the mountains before the midday heat. So around 2 in the morning, we rolled onto the highway, each rig in line, CB radios on. I took the middle position. Everything was fine until the lead driver radioed that he'd seen a loose bull at the shoulder. That's common enough, unfortunately. We stayed alert. About 10 minutes later, my headlights picked up a large shape running by the edge of the road. Could have been that bull, but the shape looked off, like its legs were too long or the stride was unnatural. With each step, it seemed closer. I hollered at the lead truck on the CB, but he said he only saw a head of cattle kind of far away. Another driver teased, "Mac, you need some sleep, man." Then the creature darted straight across the lane in front of me. I slammed the brakes to avoid hitting it. The truck behind me braked too. That animal stood on the road, unperturbed by the noise or by us trying to maneuver around it. On impulse, I gunned it to get past. Standing still, there was dangerous. As I pulled alongside, something slammed against my trailer, like it had jumped at the side. I veered onto the wrong side of the road out of reflex, almost losing control on the curve. I expected the trailer to be dented, but when I straightened out and checked my mirrors, I saw nothing. No creature, no damage. My convoy buddies insisted the bull was still on the shoulder and never touched my rig. My palms were slick with sweat, my heart hammering. Once in Houston, I told the office what happened. Flavio, my supervisor, took me aside. I expected him to laugh or send me to get my head checked, but he admitted he'd seen weird things himself, driving through those mountains at night. He said quite a few seasoned truckers avoided that route in the dark. "I'll see if I can move you to a different run, Mac. It's tricky, but I don't want to lose a good driver," he said. By then I was terrified of returning to that stretch of highway. The sense of danger, the apparitions only I seemed to witness, the banging on the trailer. I started watching every shadow on the road, praying more often, asking for my dad's guidance, and even talking with the pastor at my mum's church. I wanted to believe it was all fatigue, but deep down, I felt there were secrets out there we just can't explain. Eventually, Flavio landed me a route connecting Midland to Oklahoma City, a completely different drive. I jumped at the offer. The transition took time, but it worked out. I left the Davis Mountains behind and never encountered anything like that again. I still hear stories about people who claim they've come across the old Chevy, or that strange woman by the roadside, or animals that vanish into thin air. I don't know if it's all a product of collective fear or if something truly supernatural resides in those hills. All I know is that on the quietest nights, when I recall what I went through, I feel that chill again and prefer not to push my luck. Some places blur the lines between our world and something else we can't fully grasp, and we're not always prepared to face it. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Click the notification bell to stay updated on all future narrations. I post new videos here every day. I hope to see you in the next one. On the screen now, I'm leaving 2 other great videos I know you'll enjoy. See you there.